Okay, I'm going to try to make a video for you guys. I had something written out, and then I thought they don't want to read something else. So, as I'm going to try my best here. So, a lot of times when people get to this point in the course, they really don't know what to do with all they've learned, and they start feeling like, I've learned so much about injustices, and, for the white students, often it's like a first time awakening to the reality of white privilege. And there's this huge, like, like settling in feeling of guilt. And sometimes there can be just this feeling of paralysis of like, now that I know, what do I do? And then a lot of times for the students of color, it's a little disillusioning that here are people who, haven't even realized that like racism exists. And sometimes that's encouraging because it's like, oh, they didn't even know. And then other times it's like, how can you not even know? So I just wanted to speak to those feelings. Three things that I have been thinking about for the last couple of years as kind of an answer to race fatigue in my own life. This is not like some big societal answer or anything like that, but this is just how I have come to grapple with the things that I realize and learn, and then the areas in which I realize that I have not known or done enough. So here they are. Number one, somebody in the course, I think, already mentioned this verse, guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life, and different translations have different ways of saying it. But basically, all of life springs out of our hearts. And so as I submit to God's sanctifying work in me and seek his sanctifying work in me, then as I gain knowledge, I want him to put that knowledge to work in love for others and for God. So all of these things that we learn, even if we don't know immediately what to do with them, don't lose heart with that, because God will take that knowledge, and the time to use it may come when you least expect it. But still, you expect God, when this knowledge is needed, to prompt you to use it in the way that you should. So just keep learning and keep developing, keep seeking understanding. So in all thy getting, get understanding. I love that verse. So the second thing is to stand up for people. So now that you know some things about what has happened, stand up for people. So if you're an African American student and you're in a group sometime that just doesn't get it about injustice, you can know that really a lot of that comes from ignorance. Not always, but help people understand. Step in there, step in the gap. And as a white person, I can say that it has, this kind of standing up for people has shown me the ways in which I really have known more about injustice and white privilege and racism and discrimination and prejudice than I even realized I knew. So there are three moments in like, let's say, the last decade that really stood out to me as like, wow, you really do know more about this than you thought you did. I 10 years ago would have argued that everybody's on an equal playing field and that racism really isn't a problem anymore in this country. But I had three experiences that really told me something different. One, there was an West African woman at our church who lost her housing for just her building was sold, so she needed a new place to live. And she didn't know how to use a computer. So she'd been here in the United States for 35 years and had just been working sort of subsistence jobs. And she was here legally, but really couldn't get ahead. So she didn't even know how to use the internet or the computer. And so when she lost the housing she'd had for a long time, she sort of, freaked out and was really worried. So I said, no, you know what? Come in the church office and let me help you. I'll show you how you can look for housing. So the first place I took her was Craigslist. And so I took her on there, and it's something that to me is just so simple. I took her on there and I said, look, here are all these places for rent. Here's the price range that you want. And then I showed her, you can look at pictures, and there are phone numbers for landlords, and you can email them. And before I even realized it, I heard myself saying to her, this all happened so fast. I was like, hey, you know what? Do you want me to call for you about these places? And then I thought, why did I just offer to do that? And I realized that it was because I had this sort of concern that if this potential landlord heard her West African accent, they might rule her out to begin with, that they would wonder whether she's a desirable tenant or not, based on her accent. And that made me feel bad. And I kind of had one of these, what do they call it? A metacognitive moment of realizing that I knew something that I knew, and I'd known it longer than I realized, that she may be discriminated against for housing based on her accent. Maybe that reflected something about me, that maybe I would have that kind of prejudice. And so when I realized that, um, I, I really had to examine my own heart, and it was kind of a prejudice awakening for me. So then there was an African woman at our church, also a West African woman, who was getting the runaround, I thought, on her medical treatment. She had an obvious medical problem. Everybody at the church knew she did, but she never got a satisfying answer. And it was another similar experience that before I even realized it, I said, you know what? Let me go with you next time you go to the doctor, or let so and so go with you the next time you go to the doctor, so that we can talk to the doctor with you. Because then I thought, you know what, maybe she's not getting the attention she deserves because she's black, or she's a foreigner, or they feel like she doesn't have support or money or whatever. So I realized that prejudice did exist, and that I knew that it existed. And then the third thing, there was a rambunctious little boy in the church children's program. There were three rambunctious boys, but the one who had black skin, his parents are West African immigrants, he got in trouble more often than the others, and a lot of times he deserved it. But there was at least one time that I wasn't sure he deserved it, and there was one night when I felt, I didn't know it, but I just suspected that the children's director was being unfair toward him, particularly unfair, and I couldn't see a reason for it. And I felt that I should say something to her about that, and just challenge her and say, why are you picking on him more than the other kids? It feels like a racial thing to me. But you know what? I didn't do it. And then when I pulled the kid off to the side and lavished all this niceness on him, instead of defending him in the moment, which would have been really meaningful to him. And then I had to go back after the fact and talk to this children's worker and just say, I didn't want to create waves, and I didn't want to talk to you about it. But here's what I'm wondering, and I don't know if it's true, but it kind of looks like that. But I was ashamed that I was so slow. And so in our discussion this past week, we've had a lot of conversation about personal risk and how that has played into the church's response or lack of response to injustices in society. And I guess that was a really small way in which I saw that this thought of personal risk really affected me. And this was many years ago. But still, it was an eye-opening experience to me about my own tendencies to show preferential treatment and to protect myself instead of other people. So, you know what? When my confidence in God is right, and then I don't need to protect myself as much, but I have to confess sin and be honest about those things. So the third thing is to seek out ways to include people. I think that it's probably very difficult for people of the dominant culture or of a majority group in a certain situation to imagine what it feels like to be different. And that's something I understand very well. And I think it's made me be very, I don't know, cognizant of how other people may be feeling in a certain situation. So to seek to include people, there's a popular discipleship program that the kind of the whole premise of it is walk across the room. Just simply have the courage to walk across the room. You may feel awkward doing it, but to walk across the room to welcome other people, to make them feel welcome. And so the way this plays out for me is that, like in our denominational associations or district events, I walk in and look actively for the people who may feel left out, even if it's a group of them. So if it's mostly white people and there's a small group off to the side of Latino or Caribbean folks standing all together off to the side, I it feels uncomfortable to walk up if it's people that I don't know and they're in a conversation, but just to walk up and say hi and introduce myself and then listen to them and just to try to make them feel included by someone who represents the majority group. And then to do what I can do to make sure they're included not just in a symbolic way, but in an official, meaningful way, so that they have access to information and that they have a voice in decision making. So what I've been advocating for in our district is that ballots have bios on them, and so it's not enough to just put the names of people of color or women on a ballot for district positions or committees. Actually, people need to know who these folks are, and if you are not an insider, if you're not on the inside circle, you don't know who those people are on the list. And if you are on the inside circle and the people on the list are not from the inside, you're not going to vote for them because you don't know anything about them. So I've been advocating to have names, have bios and even photos included on the ballots so that people really know who they're voting for. And yeah, just so I was on nominating committee last year, and I called the sort of influential pastor in our area for the Caribbean congregations and just said, hey, you know what? This district needs more people of color on committees. Your perspective is needed, and I don't know the people. So could you tell me about some of the people in your churches and you recommend people that could be on the ballot? And so he did. He thought about it and gave me several names. I called a woman and said, who are some women and people of color who could be listed on the ballot here? And so I got the bios and the names of people that I could recommend. So those are kind of my three things. They're not like earth shaking, but they're just three ways. One is continue to build knowledge, so that God can refine my heart, which is the wellspring of life, and all of my actions and values and everything else. Number two is just to stand up for people when I am aware that something isn't right, and number three, to include people actively, not just symbolically, but in our structures as well, to do things that make sure that people are included. And inclusion means that they have a voice in decision making and that they have access to information. So there you go.